Hello, everyone, and welcome to episode 20 of And the Beat Goes On. I can't believe we're at episode 20. It means that we've really been here in the coronavirus for quite some time now. So thank you for joining us, and we are so pleased to welcome today our guest, Eileen Guenther. Thank you. Welcome.
Thank you for having me. I'm delighted to be here.
And we also have on with us Brittany Stanton, the Director of Education here at the choir school and our assistant conductor.
Hi, everybody. Glad to be here today.
So we are so excited. Eileen, I cannot tell you just how excited I am to have you on. I love the work that you do. I have mentioned it many a day on and I am have been introduced to your work via the ACDA Eastern Division Conference. I attended the session that you and Everett did, Everett McCorvey, the director of the American Spirituals Ensemble, and I was blown away. I went home and I bought this book and I read it, and since then I haven't stopped talking about it. So it's just been such a great journey with that book, and it's really it's been wonderful. So tell us, how are you doing in this pandemic?
Well, I'm doing probably about like everybody else is. You should mention Rochester and ACDA, because that weekend was my last weekend of anything. Yeah. I flew home, a little nervous flying, but I flew home after that and a couple of other presentations I did in Rochester, and things just came to a complete stop.
Yep.
For me and probably for everybody else. Remember exactly
Absolutely.
The last time we went out to dinner, which was March 11th, and haven't been since.
Absolutely.
But there's time for doing other things, and I'm sure, everybody's kind of discovering maybe a little bit of chill time, downtime, organize the files, the photos, the whatever that you've been meaning to and you never had time. And if you say you didn't have time and you're not doing it now, that means you don't really intend to do it at all, because you do have time.
That's right.
I'm saying that
Absolutely.
To me. So it's fine. I hope you are
good,
as well.
Good. It's funny that you mentioned that because the choir school, we were performing there on that conference, and we too, that was literally the last hurrah, if you will. It was, one big Mardi Gras before this extended period of Lent. It's really been, it was a good way, I think, to end and to kind of, come to a shutdown and a close. It really was a wonderful way, that conference, and seeing the presentation that you did was just a huge part of that, and that cathartic feeling, and just thank you again for it. It was wonderful. If anyone who wasn't there or didn't come to that conference and see that session, I have to tell you, you really missed out. So you really did. So tell us, for our viewers who might not know you or the work that you do, can you just tell us a little bit about yourself and your work?
Sure. I'm a church musician and an organist. I've played about 250 organ recitals around the world, and have served Episcopal, Lutheran, UCC, and United Methodist churches. And I was, for the longest time of my career, was at Founder United Methodist Church. And I was there during the time, I was just thinking about this as President Clinton was on the John Lewis memorial service, and the Clintons went to Foundry at that time, and were very appreciative of our choir's music. The choir sang at the White House a bunch of times, and it was kind of a special time of feeling like, what we sing is going into the heart and the ears of someone who can make a difference in the world. And there would be times that anthems would end up being quoted in presidential speeches.
Wow, that's pretty cool.
I didn't take pride exactly, but I was really happy to see that happening. And it came to the point that I thought, well, I need to move to spend more of my time at Wesley Seminary, and I'd been teaching there very part-time and became more full-time there. And that's an opportunity to work with students who are, I mean, they're graduate students and who are preparing for, maybe it's an NGO kind of work, but most of them for the pastoral ministry. And to direct the choir, direct the chapel services sometimes, and teach all kinds of music courses, including spirituals. And maybe this would be right now the time to mention Dr. William B. McLean, who has been my colleague and mentor. This book is dedicated to him, and he actually wrote a very nice blurb on the back, and I didn't tell him it was dedicated to him, and his wife promised she wouldn't tell either, so that it wasn't, that was a surprise. But he is an amazing preacher and an amazing activist. He worked with Dr. King, and he basically took me under his wing and found that I had a passion and some knowledge. We taught together for a lot of years, and then when he retired, I taught the course, and the book kind of came out of our teaching together. I had mentioned to you earlier that in our classes, and he would affirm this, I think there was not one single class we ever taught that someone didn't say, "What's the middle passage?" And at that point, I'm thinking, okay, maybe there needs to be a book here. It was going to be only about spirituals and the musical part. And Mark Lawson of Morningstar Music Publishers was very supportive. But then I said, maybe we need to just broaden it a little. Well, we broadened it to 520 pages. That's not little. It's more like a doorstop, actually. But it took, the music and then put it into the context. And that really is where I think we need to be. We have to know the context if we're going to sing this music and make a difference. And if we don't, we're just appropriating. And I'd be happy to talk more about that. But if you don't know the context, we apply performance practice, study, and art to the rest of the music that we do. If we're doing Brahms or if we're doing jazz or whatever, we know what it's about. Spirituals, being folk music, sometimes get shoved to the side a little bit and don't get the kind of attention they deserve. And I think that's something that needs to be fixed.
So tell us, how did you, tell us your musical story. So when did you get interested in music? How did that, what was your training like? And then how did you get particularly interested in spirituals? Like how did that kind of, tell us that arc.
Okay, my mom was a church musician. She was my first piano teacher. I do not ever remember not playing the piano. I sat next to her or in the sanctuary with her as she, directed the music at various churches, and ended up going to the University of Kansas. We were living in the Midwest, and I did 2 bachelor's degrees, one in English, because I really liked to write. That turned out to stand me in fairly good stead, and one in Oregon. And then I got a fellowship to the Catholic University of America, where I did a master's of musicology and a doctorate in organ, and started doing the church music teaching career, teaching applied lessons at George Washington University, where I'm still on the faculty, and just doing what one does as a church musician. And then they needed someone to come do the choir, I think it was, only at Wesley. So I kind of moved there, and that was very part-time, but it was very close to my heart. And then gradually was drawn into the power of spirituals by seeing, directly experiencing how congregations reacted to the spirituals when we sang them in services. I mean, I had a great choir at Foundry when I was there. It's still a very fine choir. There was basically no music we couldn't do. We had resources, orchestra, and so forth. It didn't matter. The music that spoke to people most directly were spirituals. And I have come to believe that spirituals are the most directly affecting music that exists, from the heart to the heart, from the circumstances out of which they were born to our hearts as human beings who are wanting to make a difference.
That's amazing, and that's a great kind of story and unfolding and blossoming there. So thank you for sharing that with us. Tell us about your book. What's the title of it, and what's it about?
Would you like to see it?
Yes, please do. Everyone likes a good old-fashioned show and tell.
Yeah.
I'm not sure if I'm holding it the
Yep.
way I should, and it's all kinds of little marks and so forth. It's called, in their own words, Slave Life and the Power of Spirituals. And I've got a couple things to say. The word slave is a controversial term right now. And I angsted, if that's even a word, hugely about the title. And there were a couple of people who said enslaved, or, altering that term somewhat. But I have a group of folks, 5 or 6 close African-American colleagues and friends that I know will tell me the truth. And I said, okay, guys, what should I do here? Because at the point that it was really ready to go to the publisher, people began, there was stuff in press and so forth, academic circles, about the word slave as defining of a person rather than of a condition. And to a person of the folks I asked, they said, do not change it. And Dr. McLean was most forceful in that, because this whole book is a retrospective. It is not now forward, really. It stops at the civil rights movement, and it starts with the Middle Passage. And they called themselves this. And for me to have, I changed it a few times, but I couldn't just change what their terms were. And if there are quotes that are a little not the language you would use today, they were not changed. I was completely advised to leave them alone. So the book is, you're going to be sorry you asked this, because I can kind of not stop. But it's in their own words, and it's there are primary sources, which any researcher just likes more than anything, to get to a primary source. What somebody said, not what somebody said about what somebody said. And there are 204 books, book-length documents, written or dictated between 1789 and approximately emancipation. I mean, it's hard to say exactly when the last one was, because they kind of kept coming out later. If they were dictated, that was because the person who was doing the writing was not able to write. And of course, writing for those who were enslaved was pretty much illegal most places and subject to huge punishment. So if you did it intentionally and very quietly. But they could dictate their experiences, and they did, very dramatically. It was a huge part of the abolitionist movement to have people who had escaped talking about what was going on in slavery, because largely people were, they diminished it. They didn't want to think that what was going on was as bad as it was. So you've got the 204 books. Then fast forward to the Federal Writers Project between 1936 and 38. Post-Depression, everybody needed work. Educators, researchers, writers, all needed work. And they were sent by the federal government to any state that had slaves. So there were approximately 100,000 formerly enslaved people still living at the time. And these people were sent out with a list of questions, and they took them down. And those you just a second ago mentioned to me are lodged at the Library of Congress. So it's so moving to see their words and to see what it was like. And many of them were living fairly close to where they had been working as an enslaved person. And they didn't want to talk too much, because they may be down the road from the descendants of the people who had owned them. And they didn't want their stipends to get messed up. Their living, their financial support, they just didn't want to jeopardize that at all. Others said, you want to talk about slavery? I'll tell you about slavery. And they wouldn't stop talking, because somebody was listening. Wow. And so we have 2,300 interviews that are lodged in that.
2,300. Wow.
And there are another about 400 that have fairly recently been made available by the University of the South. I think that's the right university, just a couple of years ago. And that was after my book was all finished. So that's yet for me to deal with. But this is primary stuff. So it talks about, and I'm going to look over here at my list to make sure that I don't lose track, talks about the history of slavery, and the Middle Passage, and we can talk more about that, daily life of those enslaved, punishment. And oh, by the way, let me just say, the punishment was horrific and sadistic. And don't let anybody say, oh, the happy slave thing. Don't ever buy, nobody's going to buy that, I really trust, because they were treated often, they were property. They weren't treated as valued property. Doesn't make any sense, but that was it. So they spent more time talking about punishment and liberation. Those are the two subjects that they dealt with more than anything else. The book also talks about evangelization and escape and the way they were created. I mean, I can unpack each of these. I have testimonies. So if you have a spiritual swing low, I have found something that in their own words talks about swing low or about chariots. So the whole point of that chapter, I think it's chapter 5 maybe, is that when you are working with a particular spiritual with your choir or even your congregation, you can have a quote like we did in the concert that you heard with the American Spiritual Ensemble, to give the context. This is not just music that exists on its own. It has history. It was born of pain. We need to know that. It's not just that there are songs of sorrow. W.E. Du Bois talked about that. There are also songs of hope and joy, but the roots are in the sorrow. And the fact is that regardless of what the song is, there may be songs of joy that are not coming out of joy, but are aspirational for joy and transformative of one's spirit. So that's kind of a sum. There's a couple of indices in the rest of my elevator speech here. A scripture and spiritual and spiritual and scripture. So if you have a particular scripture that you want to tie to, these are the spirituals that go with it. And if you have a spiritual and you want to figure out what scripture is connected, you can do that. So there are two different indices both ways. And I had some really great help to help me put that together.
That's amazing. So it's like a concordance of sorts.
Exactly. And then there's the other kind of big thing is that there are themes. So I identified, I think, 40 themes in the spirituals. And they don't all have the same number of spirituals within a given theme, but just the breadth, the panoply of subjects that they covered is amazing. So elevator speech finish.
Well, it was so great, and I wrote down a couple of things that I'm hoping you can tell us a little bit more about that we want to tease out. I definitely want to take a moment to talk about the Middle Passage. I think it is really, really important that folks understand the Middle Passage, its horrors, and exactly what that was. Can you help us understand the Middle Passage? You know, for those who might have had, through no fault of their own, gaps in their own education, because I went to predominantly Black and brown schools and I didn't have this. So tell us, what's the Middle Passage?
I will talk about it. And I want to say before I say that this entire subject is one that I approach with extreme humility. Everybody watching can tell my skin is lighter than yours. And our experiences wouldn't be the same, although I've worked very hard at understanding the experiences of my African-American friends. But the Middle Passage was horrific. The number of Africans taken from their homes between approximately the 16th and the mid-19th centuries. You have 10, 11 million on one end, 20 million on the other. Why the diversity? Well, the record keeping was a little, you know, not what it might have been. So we don't know for sure how much, how many people were taken. Many also died, a couple of places. They died from the times they were kidnapped from their home until when they hit the ship. And they might walk in a coffle, chained or connected to other people who had been captured. I mean, this is a diabolical system starting in Europe. The Europeans had goods that the Africans wanted, so they traded gunpowder and alcohol for people. Then you get them walked to the coast where there would be a ship waiting to be full enough to be worth shipping, taking people. There are 40 what they called slave factories, which were forts that kept people for the purpose of holding them until there were enough to make the passage. Passage took maybe 2 or 3 months, depended on the wind, of course. And they were treated just dreadfully. There's nothing else to say. There were disease, malnutrition, sheer abuse of women and children, anything that you can name of a horrific nature probably went on in that ship. They were packed in. So while they maybe should have had 100, they may have had 300 people together. So the conditions were dreadful. They get over to the West, which would have been Brazil, the West Indies, North America. And in terms of people, Brazil had 4 million. North America had slightly less than 500,000 people on these, and others, around. So you're getting up to your 20 million or so people, that's a lot. And where they were sold, and it's hard to say exactly how many passages. Some would say 20 to 35,000, others would say up to 60,000 different ship sailings across the Atlantic. So the Middle Passage term, diaspora, ma'afa, there are several ways to call that, goes from Europe to Africa, where Europeans had goods that were traded for people. The people were shipped to the West, wherever that was, where they were sold. And they were also traded for goods here. Tobacco, cotton. King Cotton is not just a phrase. Cotton drove the US economy. And the economy was indeed driven by the free labor of those who were enslaved. It would not have happened otherwise. They couldn't have paid people to do what they were asked to do. And so then the cotton went back to Europe, or the tobacco, or the whatever product. Then it just kept going. So that was the Middle Passage, was the part that went between Africa and the West.
Wow, thank you for that. Then another part of the experience of those who are enslaved that I want to also drill down on, and is complex, is that the nature of these spirituals are sacred, yet these enslaved peoples were not Christian. Can you talk to us a little bit about the evangelism and how this kind of came to be, in America?
Well, again, there's nothing about this subject, any of these aspects, that are easy. And it was, the whole evangelization picture is a little complicated, because first they had to decide if those who were enslaved, if the Africans were human. Did they have souls that could be saved? And feel free to look real surprised at that or not. But that was, and there were all kinds of state codes that were passed that said, yes, no, whatever. Could they be baptized? If they were baptized into a church, did that mean they were also free? No. And there were specific codes again that said that civil law and religious law were 2 separate things. So that didn't, that did not engender freedom on the, if they were baptized. And I'm kind of just hitting the tips of the iceberg here. The early 1800s, the camp meetings, Second Great Awakening, evangelization kind of took off. There were missionaries that came to the United States from Europe. For instance, some, Anglican church folks, basically to serve the Anglican population in the States, but then they worked with other, began to form what are called Magnolia missions, just, taking the religion to the folks. And some places did not want anything to do with evangelization, and the owners wouldn't allow it. And then they started thinking, maybe they'll be better workers maybe there'll be more docile slaves. Do what we want if they're Christian. So then that flipped, but it was an economic decision. It wasn't a personal decision or a religious decision. They wanted more work out of the people that they owned. And so there were some folks, I mean, the way Christians behaved is deplorable. They said one thing and they did something else. And my favorite line in any of the spirituals is in the spiritual, I've got a robe or I've got shoes. It goes by both titles. And the phrase is, everybody talking about heaven ain't going there. Because there was a lot of talk about heaven, and a person who owned someone might serve them communion in church in the morning and then beat the out of them that afternoon or the next day. Mm-hmm. So the hypocrisy was amazing. And I find it amazing, frankly, that anybody wanted to adopt a religion of people who were capable of doing that. And there was a lot of talk about, I can't possibly. But then there were people who said, well, I think I can manage. And this sort of cognitive dissonance, I'm not sure what the right word would be, would say, I know they're behaving badly, but I also know that religion has a value for me.
I imagine what a great personal conflict inside that must cause for somebody whenever, I mean, just alone the issues around whether somebody's acting as a Christian or not, based on their beliefs. But to see, to end up in a place where they love that faith and they sing the songs to their God, but knowing the history of it, what internal conflict must be going on.
Mm-hmm. It's almost, it's hard to imagine. It is just so hard to imagine. And I think that was one of the things that struck me so much, about this book, was just how like really real it was. And real, being a Black person, I thought, yeah, well, I know about some spirituals and gospel, grew up with them, blah, 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 blah. But then I never really took the moment to stop and say like, wait, like this was not like, this was not these people's it really is mind-blowing. It really is mind-blowing. And it's so hard to believe that even still to this day, like that Christianity is still the predominant, religion of Black people in America. And so it's like, it's amazing and wonderful and beautiful, and yet born out of this very complex and very sad history that is hard to reconcile. And I don't think necessarily that it can be reconciled.
Let me add one thing, which is that they came often with religion. An African panoply of gods. They were not a-religious necessarily. And what they did was meld what we would call traditional Christianity with their traditional Christianity into something that is called a tertium quid, a third thing. Something that doesn't exactly conform to one side or the other, but melds aspects and ritual from both sides. So it's richer in a way for combining both aspects.
And I think that's really, 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 really wonderful. A question for you: how would help us understand when spirituals would have been, they were work songs. So were the slaves just singing these in the fields? Were they singing these? And so, like, help us really understand, because I find that most people, myself, I raise my hand, to be number one, really, really don't know exactly how these pieces were used. Was there a difference between being in the field to what might have happened on kind of downtime? Like, what was going on? How did it happen? How was it sung?
Well, I wished we'd had MP3 players back then. So we really would know the answer to your question. But they talked a lot about this, and they sang all the time. In Africa, they sang all the time. There is a song for everything, from birth to first tooth, to puberty, to a good harvest, to wedding. Any aspect of life had music. That was their African tradition. People say, where did spirituals come from? Well, they came from Africa. They're not necessarily African songs because they were created in a different way, but they were African inspired and sometimes African melodies and rhythms too. So whatever goes on, if you're grinding grain or you're spinning or you're weaving or you're working in the field or you're cleaning cotton, you're singing. We know everything goes better with music. People who go out jogging, I don't know, you look like you might be a jogger. I'm
Yeah.
not, but I know people who jog. And they'll have the headphones on and you can set something for how fast you'd like the music to be. How many beats per minute will give you the speed of your walk or your jog. So as they are working, they are singing. Makes it less annoying to sing. They can work more quickly. And interesting, the leader of the song was a highly valued person in the society. It depended on what song he started, and it was always, I think I've never read about anything but a he, although I'm sure women started if there was a group of women. But anyway, the leaders, say in the fields, would start a song, the song he chose, and the tempo. And they talk about, he can't be the leader anymore because he starts it too fast and that makes us work too hard. And you know, so that was a disincentive. But music pervaded everything. And yeah, there were work songs that morphed into religious songs. I bristle when someone says they were composed, because I think a better word is they were created. You start a song, someone else picks up, someone else picks up. By the time it comes around again, it may have changed, or we may add verses. I mean, this is one of the reasons that call response is the most prevalent genre, because, okay, you're the caller and you have a little bit of biblical knowledge because you've heard some sermons and picked up some phrases. You might have even snuck around and figured out how to read that Bible a little bit. So you would know how to start the song, and the rest of us would just respond. And we only needed a phrase. And of course, if we're working scattered around the fields, this is not like, you know, verse after verse after verse. You create the verses as the leader, and we just respond. We could talk about this, or we could maybe listen, if it's possible, to Ride the Chariot.
Absolutely.
In which I have a little bit of a song here. Are you ready, my brother? Oh, yes. Are you ready for the journey? Oh, yes. Do you want to see your Jesus? Oh, yes. So all the group does is just respond the oh, yes. This is an arranged spiritual, which is not the same way it would have been to start with, when the folks took down and made note of and created, and I don't know what I did with my book, the first collection of spirituals called Slave Songs of the United States, 1867. These are not necessarily anthemized. The anthemization came later. The concert spiritual came later. And that's the way we know them most. But we also have this to give us the original, and it's a Dover publication, if I can say that, which means it's not, you know, everybody can access it. So this is Ride the Chariot. I don't even remember the arranger. Harrison? You may not have that information either.
Let's see.
I don't have that information linked onto this video.
Then it can be anything we want for the moment.
Well, we'll take a listen and then I'll look it up and share it out.
Okay, it's on, yeah.
Here we go.
I'm gonna ride on the chariot in the morning, Lord. I'm gonna ride on the chariot in the morning, Lord. I'm getting ready for the judgment day, my Lord, my Lord. I'm gonna ride on the chariot in the morning, Lord. I'm gonna ride the chariot in the morning, Lord. I'm getting ready for the judgment day, my Lord, my Lord. Are you ready, my brother? Are you ready for the journey?
That's William Henry Smith's arrangement. And for those who are wondering, that's SAT. That's the SATB solo one, but it also is TTBB as well. And I believe it might be available on the SSAA for those who are looking. But I've done it both SATB and TTBB for sure, if anyone is looking for that. So that is a great example of call and response. Now, some people might say, well, that spiritual sounds so happy. Like, how do we contextualize that?
We contextualize it by knowing that spirituals covered a wide variety of emotions. There are spirituals of sorrow. Nobody knows the trouble I've seen. Sometimes I feel like a motherless child. There are spirituals about nature. He's got the whole world in his hands. There are spirituals that operate in sacred time, as in My God is a Rock, which has a number of spirituals have people that didn't live together in the same song. So you have all kinds of emotions. They are from the heart to the heart. I think I said that before. And that enables us to connect with them. Also mentioned that if it is happy, that does not mean that they are happy at the moment.
Mm-hmm.
They talk a lot. Frederick Douglass wrote a lot about spirituals. We think of him for so many other reasons too. And he's my favorite guy because he wrote not one, not two, but 3 autobiographies. So that gives us lots of material. And oh, I have one thing I wanted to say. Can I insert this about Douglass?
Absolutely.
I've sometimes thought that the mere hearing of spirituals would do more to impress some minds with the horrible character of slavery than the reading of whole volumes of philosophy on the subject could do. The spirituals cut to the point, cut to the chase, and regardless of what it is, there are code songs, there are songs of liberation, all kinds. I mean, like I said, there are 40 themes. And while it sounds happy, and sometimes you just go with that, you might also say, okay, but what is underneath this? Swing Low, Sweet Chariot was sung at funerals. And it was also sung as an escape liberation song because the chariot was going to come. And it was, of course, associated with Harriet Tubman from the Eastern Shore here.
Yes.
So that's why I think the context is important, that we know, and yes, Jubilee, up-tempo songs is definitely a category. There are slow phrases. There's a Balm in Gilead, for instance, Deep River, soul-wrenching. And also the Ride the Chariot would probably be, it's a call response, but it's also a segmented, punchy, different. The third style is of syncopated rhythms, and that would count as that too. That was just sort of, energizing. And spirituals were very often motivational. They motivated those who were singing them to survive, to escape. And if you want to fast forward to the civil rights movement, they motivated them to march, to be willing to go to jail, and to fight for their rights. Ain't Gonna Let Nobody Turn Me Around is a spiritual. The original spirit songs of the civil rights movement were spirituals that got new texts. Mm-hmm. So while we say originally ain't gonna let nobody turn you around, in the civil rights movement, ain't gonna let Sheriff Clark turn you around, ain't gonna let Chief Pritchett turn me around, and ain't gonna let the dogs turn me around, ain't gonna let the fire hoses turn me around. And they changed and added a word or two that brought it into the current context.
And can you tell us about these code and map songs? What are those for those who might not know? What's that all about?
I can and I will, because that's one of my favorite things to talk about. You've probably already heard me say that.
Yes.
Code songs, they sang what they couldn't say. Drums were a means of communication brought with them from Africa. Then the Anglo population of owners thought, this drums, it spreads too far. It's language that we don't understand, and it reaches people we don't want to hear that. So they outlawed drums. But the songs they could sing, and it didn't take a whole lot. I mean, Harriet Tubman would have a song that would just be a little bit of a phrase that she would sing. And she had two songs. One, when she was leading folks on the Underground Railroad, one that said, "I am here," as she left them hiding and she went out to see what was happening next or check out for food or something. "I am here, you stay where you are." Or, "I am here, come ahead." And they knew which song was which. It's amazing. Swing Low was a song of associated with her. Band of Angels also associated with her. And she used what is my other kind of favorite spiritual, Wade in the Water, because it has so many different meanings. Water, the source of life before we're born, the sustainer of life after birth. Everybody goes someplace with a bottle of water. We work with singers. You don't ever see singers without water.
Mm-hmm.
Water is related to baptism, which was the most important and really one of the very few rituals of life of the enslaved. People would come from around, they would dam up the creek or the river, or if there was a lake, use it for immersion baptism. And it was a big deal. Water was a boundary between enslavement and freedom. They sang about the Jordan, but they really meant the Ohio, from slave territory to free. There's healing, referencing Jesus's miracle at the pool of Bethesda. And there's a song, there's a signal for escapees. Many times those escaping would go along the side of a waterway because there were no signs. They were not able to read them anyway. And it was just very complicated to know. Escape sounds really easy. It was very hard and very scary. And I think it was Solomon Northup that wrote that he had walked for 3 days in circles, ended up where he'd started, which meant he'd used up his food and he had put himself at risk for no gain. So walking along a waterway, a creek or a river, meant you at least had some idea where you were going. And Wade in the Water meant we're on the side now, but we're going to need to go to the water because we hear the dogs. And dogs were a very frightening aspect of escape. And there were dogs that were trained to particularly attack those with dark skin. I mean, there was a whole cottage industry of that horrible thing. So that was it. And of course, God's going to trouble the water, the refrain. And they firmly believed that freedom would come. And if it didn't come for them, it might come for their children or their grandchildren, but it would come because God was not going to let this wrong system continue forever.
I love that. And I love that even that contextualization about running from the dogs and, where can they not be followed into, is to think that to be in that position is horrifying. And this is also a wonderful example. I love when people say, Ariane, why are Black people so mad? And my eyebrow goes up and I'm like, explaining things like Wade in the Water and these actual conditions, which led to real historical trauma, which we can still see today, from dogs being used to slavery, to dogs being used in Jim Crow America, to dogs being used even during the Civil Rights Movement. Even I actually saw pictures of dogs in Portland, and I thought, this is disgusting, that the fact that this history is still amongst us today. And I think of so many Black people I know who have this fear of dogs, and it is absolutely due to historical trauma. And there are just so many stories that talk about this. And so these tropes about, and stereotypes about Black people being afraid of dogs or being afraid to swim and all of these things come directly from this history. And so I think it's incredible that this is enshrined in these songs. And that is part of the reason why they deserve so much respect and reverence and scholarship all at the same time. And that's why it's so complex.
Tagging onto that, patrollers and slave catchers were part of the slaveocracy, if you will. And people made their money at finding slaves who had left the plantation without a pass. Sometimes they would find slaves with a pass and they go and would rip the pass up. Oh, no more pass. And they were there to return the property. And whether it was by someone who had actually escaped far away, and there were lots of signs for slaves, but these folks, there was a profession. So, you know, the whole thing with policing now and relationship to African American population goes back a long time.
Yes, absolutely. It's just amazing to me how what an opportunity and responsibility that we have as musicians and as choir directors to be guardians of this history. It really is a tremendous responsibility. How might you suggest that choral directors, church musicians, teachers, conductors, how do we introduce our choirs to spirituals? How do we even approach it? And particularly, like, if you're a white educator, I'm sure there's even more anxiety around it because you want to make sure you do it right, because you don't want to be on the wrong side of history. How help us think through this, and perhaps some ways we might approach programming spirituals and educating.
I do have a few ideas.
Yeah.
And I've just finished an article on cultural appropriation for the hymn, in which I did a lot of reading, because this is kind of related. How do you do this? How do you do it faithfully? How do you do it without looking like you are stealing somebody else's intellectual property? What do you say when someone says, they stole everything else from me, they can't have my music too? Versus, does art have ownership? Is there a universality to this? For me, the answer is, this is a great social justice opportunity. You can take the song, you can talk about the history, you can use the music, not in a sense of using it, but in a sense of allowing it to open up topics of conversation that you might not feel comfortable or be able to have otherwise, with your choir, with soloists, with congregations. I have to say, I mean, that was one of the reasons my book was so important to me, is because it gives their words. It can take, while I talk a lot, but it can take me out of the picture, because I am not the important part of this equation. The words of the people who were affected by the slave system are what matter. And we can talk about them in all these categories and try to get people to say, okay, look at the news today and see what was going on 175 years ago. Do you see some parallels there? What can we do to make a difference? And for me, if we don't make a difference in the music we sing and the music we put on people's lips, what are we doing? I mean, for me, it's about justice. It's about beauty and transcendence of art and all of those things too. But I think justice is the underlying goal for us at this time.
And I love that idea of using words of the enslaved as a means to actually introduce this music. And I had never seen that really done in such a beautiful way. I was recently asked in a webinar how church musicians might inform their congregations about spirituals. And there's not a lot of time. It's not like you have program notes like you do if you're going to a concert, or you don't necessarily have that opportunity to speak if there's like a liturgical function. So how have you used the words of the enslaved in those instances?
Carefully, because you're right, time is always of the essence. You can pull out a sentence or two. We sang this when this was the situation. This is how I felt at the moment. Many of the quotes are longer, but not all of them, and you can pull from them. And I think putting ourselves in the context of the time of creation gives them a breadth and a depth that the music itself has, but we're not necessarily able to unpack without a little bit of guidance, without somebody taking us by the hand. Someone could sing a solo and just say a couple of sentences, as we will hear in this. Or if it's a concert, of course, there's more opportunity for, using some of the quotes. And there are many more quotes for whatever it's worth. I've got at least another half a book in my computer because I worked with a wonderful editor, Margaret Shannon, and she kept saying, Eileen, keep the pages turning. And so we cut some, but I think it's important to do it. And if you say we have an only white congregation, why should we sing this music? I'm going to say that's exactly why you should sing this music, because the music gives an opportunity to open ourselves up to other stories, to other situations. And if we don't sing it, is it not valuable? Are the people who created it not of value? Of course they are. And let's take this music for the beauty and the depth and the transcendence it offers, and let it speak to us as singers, and it affects us who sing as well as those who listen, and give it that opportunity.
I think that's exactly it. And just one thing as well is in concerts, how have you approached kind of informing your audiences beyond program notes or saying a couple of words? Do you do anything differently than maybe speaking, or how do you handle that in the context of a concert, that education piece?
My most typical thing is to do what you heard in Rochester, which is I have put myself in the role of an African griot, although I'm a female, and I think they were mostly men, and provide a little bit of interstitial tissue, I call it, between the music pieces and the first person narratives. So I think you can do that speaking. You can do that. I have did a wonderful program at the Cathedral, Washington Cathedral, where there was mime and there was dance. I've worked with people several times in here and a couple times in Atlanta, where they enacted the interviews or the narratives that were there, and involving senses. Sometimes I have worked with slides, PowerPoint or images. I tend to do that less. One, because you can't always rely on the technology. And two, because some of the images are just so hard. I don't want people to get stuck there. I want them to let the music enter their souls on the music's own. So, but it's, that's certainly possible, but there's, any variety of ways. I think the most important thing is for the conductor or the performer to do their homework, to know what it is we're singing about, and let it, work with it a little bit. Don't just say, oh, that's a cute song. Somebody put on Facebook asking, I want a recommendation for a fun spiritual, and I practically jumped through the screen. And I don't try to get in arguments on Facebook. I really do know better. Sometimes I do err, and I did in this case. I said, let's think about this for a minute. Other people jumped in too. If you're asking this, there are arrangements that are up-tempo, Jubilee style. But a fun spiritual, I don't think. Which also leads me to a little bit of a soapbox, that if you see the name of somebody having composed a spiritual, they didn't. They arranged it. There is a group of people now who are thinking of calling what they're writing now in 2021 spirituals, but that's not the same as the historic spiritual. And if you are going to use a historic spiritual and arrange it, you need to know what the story is, and you need to study diction, and there's a whole realm of things to make yourself aware of before you just jump in. But spirituals, the only spiritual, as far as I know, that actually has the name of a composer possibly attached to it is Nat Turner and Steal Away. It was used during his insurrection, 1831, in Virginia. And we know he sang it and was inspired by it and perhaps contributed to it. We will never know because, you know, somebody starts it, somebody else continues it, and that's what happens.
Yeah. And can you help us? Steal Away is also, that's a great story. Maybe you can kind of tell us about that story and maybe tell us the difference between kind of the coding and then the allegories, the allegorical kind of quality and the symbolic quality of the spiritual.
I'm not positive I'm on your track there.
Like the symbols in there, like what does the promised land mean, or what is the North Star?
Okay, yeah, promised land is free. It's Canaan. Canaan was our north. Freedom on the other side of the Mason-Dixon line, on the other side of the Ohio River. Free states, enslaved states. And so there were many things that alluded to that. There was a theory that someone had that was a map song, but then other people have said, no, probably not. And I'm kind of on the probably not thing for a couple reasons that will probably take us too far away for right now. But those are things that you look at and you know, okay, there is a map song, which is Follow the Drinking Gourd. And we know that is legitimate. And I don't actually understand how people could follow a North Star because I barely can follow my GPS. But they did, and they wrote about it, and there was a system that they figured out. And of course, freedom, more songs, there are more call and response style songs, but the subject that gets more attention than any other subject in music is freedom.
Now, when you are working, when you have a congregation or an audience at a concert, how often do you involve them in actually singing along, doing call and response with them?
As often as possible.
And I think that was what struck me so much about Rochester, was to be a part of it.
And in Rochester, we would have had more audience or congregation singing, except that we had such a fine group there.
Yeah, I know. I was like, shh, don't sing.
Well, when you have that group there, you want to hear what they do.
Yes.
For a normal congregation, you would have a choir, but if they can hear the choir every week, or at least before COVID, everybody could hear the choir every week. That was a different thing. But for people to get a chance to just absorb this music and be inspired by it is a gift to the congregation. And I don't know if you would say do one every week, do one once a month. I mean, it's so hard to know. But there has been said, oh, spirituals aren't sung anymore, particularly in African-American churches. I do not believe that to be true. And last fall at Wesley Seminary, one of the projects that was available to the students was contacting churches. Do you sing spirituals? How often? How many? Which ones? To a person. They didn't choose the church because they sang spirituals. They went to the church to find out whether they did or didn't. There are other studies that say that spirituals are much more a part of music making than maybe would be thought. And of course, spirituals are the root of American music. I mean, everything else came out of it. And you have, the work songs that will take you up to jazz and quartet music and gospel and hip hop and rap, but those are all coming from the root of the spiritual. So I encourage as much as you can.
Yeah, that's just amazing. And we're just running a little bit short on time here, but if you were to leave us with a couple of final thoughts or a final word, what would that be?
I think I will leave us with the words of Howard Thurman. I was really fortunate to be asked to provide music and do some talk on a DVD on Thurman's life, Backs to the Wall. It's been on PBS. And so I am a big admirer of his anyway. And he says that spirituals are a source of rich testimony concerning life and death, because in many ways they are the voice, sometimes strident, sometimes muted and weary, of a people for whom the cup of suffering overflowed in haunting overtones of majesty, beauty, and power. The real significance of the songs is revealed at a deeper level of experience in the ebb and flow of the ties that feed the rivers of humankind's thinking and aspiring. Spirituals are songs of aspiration, not necessarily where we are now, but where we could be.
Absolutely. And then are there some resources that you might recommend to folks who are looking to really delve in, or to buy some things for the bookshelf, or, just, do more reading?
I have set a list, but I can just, do you want show and tell, or just want
Yes, sure. We love show and tell.
Okay. Arthur Jones, Wade in the Water. He's a psychologist and a musicologist, and he does in this book what really no other book does in terms of how spirituals speak, the from the heart to the heart thing. I don't think anybody can go very long without James Cone, Spirituals in the Blues, the late James Cone, recently. Howard Thurman, got to get this up here, Deep River. This is the original, I already held it up once, of the first collection published of spirituals, 1867. The Sea Islands, people went there to be educators and to make schools for those who had been enslaved, and ended up listening to the songs and thinking, there's just something too beautiful about this, writing them down. The real value here is less the music, which there is, than the preface that talks about the challenge of writing them down. The dialect, which we haven't even alluded to because we don't have time to talk about everything, and how difficult it was. The pitches. They didn't have a piano, and it wasn't a diatonic scale with 12 half steps. So they did pitches in a slightly different way, which made it really hard for these educators to write down. They tried their best. They worked really hard. And Ariane would sing something, and then Brittany would sing it, and we'd go back, and it wouldn't be the same. And the point of this is, then we go to another village, and the same song would sound completely different. And we who are, I don't even like this phrase, classically trained musicians get really twitchy when something isn't sung the way it's printed on the page. So maybe my final thought here is that there are versions that are not wrong, they are different. Because this is folk music, this is oral tradition. This is not, I wrote it this way and you must sing it this way. And it's a hard thing to kind of step out of, oh, that's not right. And right is the way I'm used to hearing it. So my right isn't going to be your right because I grew up singing it this way. And there's a couple of songs I grew up singing that I still can't play the way it is on the key. I mean, I could, but I kind of don't want to, the way it is on the page, because I think my way is better. But be that as it may, there's a lot of variability. And that speaks to the improvisation aspect, which we haven't even talked about, to the easy extendability. And again, the fact that what is right in one place is going to be different someplace else. And that's just the way it is.
Yeah, well, thank you for that. We definitely want to make sure that we have you back so that we can hit some of these other points. We'll have to definitely do a follow-up episode and talk about improvisation and tuning, diction, because those are all, I think, really important matters for choral conductors too, as they are, working and with these pieces and teaching them to people. So we'll definitely have to do a follow-up on all of that for sure. Well, thank you, Eileen. This has been a pleasure. Like I said, I mentioned on a comment, like I feel like I'm a kid in a candy shop, and it's just such a pleasure to have you on. Thank you for your research. It is definitely needed it is just needed. And I look forward to seeing what other articles and research and books that you'll continue to contribute.
Thank you. Thank you so much for this opportunity.
Oh, it was a pleasure.
Working with spirituals is a mission for me and a ministry, and I'm so delighted to be met with your enthusiasm, both of you, and this invitation.
Oh, thank you. Well, I hope you don't mind if we have another a follow-up session. It'll be great. It'll be great.
I'd be delighted.
And Brittany, thank you as well for being with us today. We will be posting resources here on this thread so that you can delve through them, these books, and you can order them. And of course, most importantly, I hope to see on all of my colleagues and friends' shelves in their own words. And if not, I'll give you the little for shame sign every time I see your shelf. So please do go out and purchase that, because it just might be the best thing you do for your students and your singers, and definitely for yourself. All right. Well, we are going to go on a little bit of a hiatus on the show for a couple of weeks, because the choir school is closing for our summer recess before schools reopen. So we'll not be back until mid-August. So keep your eye on for some of our guests, which we'll include when we come back. We'll be having Kevin Mimley on the show, and we'll also be having Craig Hella-Johnson. So a lot of exciting things happening when we get back from the break. So thank you for everyone who's been watching. Thank you again, Eileen, and thank you, Brittany, and everyone take it easy.
Thanks.